Let them think I don't understand, the Russian billionaire said quietly, his voice low and controlled, as if the room itself didn't deserve to hear him. And around the long polished table, no one reacted, not the investors, not the translator, not even the servers moving between tables with silent precision, because to them it was just another foreign sentence in a language they couldn't decode. But to him, it was a test, and he was watching carefully who would pass and who would fail. Victor. Volkov sat back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his tailored charcoal suit, his steel gray eyes scanning the faces around him with a calm that felt heavier than anger, because anger was loud, predictable, easy to manage, but silence, his kind of silence, carried weight, the kind that made people shift in their seats without knowing why. The translator across from him cleared his throat and began speaking again, his English smooth but slightly too polished, too rehearsed. Mr. Volkov agrees with the proposed terms, he said, smiling at the American investors, and Victor didn't move, not a blink, not a breath out of place, because that wasn't what he had said at all, not even close. But he let it hang there, let the lie stretch across the table like a thin sheet of glass, waiting to see who would notice the cracks across the room. The clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversations continued, unaware that a multi-million-dollar decision was quietly shifting course and near. The edge of the room, barely noticed, Emily Carter stood with a tray balanced in her hand, her posture straight, her movements efficient, just another waitress in a pressed white shirt and black apron, blending into the background like she had learned to do years ago. But her eyes didn't move the way the others did. They didn't drift or soften. They focused, sharp and still, locked on the table where Victor sat, because she had heard every word, not just the tone, not just the rhythm, but the meaning, the intention behind it. And when the translator spoke again, twisting another sentence into something safer, something more convenient, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel it, because she understood exactly what was happening, and more importantly, what it would cost. The investors nodded, satisfied, already discussing numbers, percentages, projections, while Victor remained still, watching, measuring, waiting, because this was the moment, the kind of moment where truth either surfaced or disappeared completely, and for a second, just a second, Emily looked away, toward the exit, toward the safe choice. The easy path, the one where she kept her job, kept her silence, and let powerful men handle their own games. But then she looked back, and something shifted, something quiet but firm, the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself. It just happens, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without asking permission, she stepped forward, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, almost lost beneath the hum of the room, until she reached the table, and the conversation paused, just slightly, just enough for someone to notice her presence. And Victor's eyes lifted, meeting hers for the first time, curious, unreadable, and Emily took a small breath, steady, controlled, and spoke in clear, fluent Russian, her voice calm but precise. That's not what he said. The words did not echo, but they landed, and for a moment, the entire table seemed to forget how to breathe. The translator froze mid-sentence, his confident smile slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty, while the investors exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to ignore what they had just heard or to acknowledge it. And Victor did not look at the translator. He did not look at the investors. He kept his eyes on her, studying the way she stood, steady, unshaken, as if stepping into this conversation had not just risked her job but had been inevitable all along. Repeat that, he said, this time in English, his tone calm but sharper, more focused, and Emily did not hesitate. She did not soften her voice or adjust her posture. She simply spoke again, this time translating clearly, word for word, correcting the message that had been altered. He said the revised terms reduce your equity share by 15% after the first quarter, and that the projected returns are intentionally understated to secure early approval. The silence that followed was heavier now, no longer confused but deliberate, because this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was exposure. The translator shifted in his seat, attempting a quick recovery. That is not accurate, he said, forcing a polite laugh. There may have been a slight misinterpretation, but his voice lacked the precision it had moments ago, and Victor finally leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze still locked on Emily. "Is that a misinterpretation?" he asked quietly, switching back to Russian. "Or a choice?" And Emily met his eyes without flinching, her response immediate, controlled. "It was a choice," she said, and the room felt it. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. One of the investors cleared his throat, glancing between them, the numbers in his mind already shifting, recalculating risk, trust, control, while the translator's composure continued to fracture, his words coming faster now, less measured. "This is highly inappropriate," he insisted. "She is not part of this discussion." And for the first time, Victor looked away from Emily, just briefly, just enough to acknowledge the man across from him. "No," he said, his voice even. "She is the only one who has been honest." And that was the moment everything changed, not because of volume, not because of authority, but because of recognition, because the truth had been spoken without permission, without position, without anything except clarity, and Emily felt it too. The shift, the invisible line that had just been crossed, where she was no longer invisible, no longer background. And yet she did not step back. She did not retreat into safety. She simply stood there, composed, as if this had never been about proving anything, only about correcting something that was wrong. Victor turned fully toward her now, his expression no longer guarded but searching. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, still in Russian, testing, measuring, and for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, but memory, brief and controlled. "I listened," she replied, her voice steady. "And I learned not to ignore what matters." Victor watched her for a long second, longer than necessary, longer than professional, as if trying to place her, not just her skill, but her presence, because people like her did not appear by accident, not in rooms like this, not in moments like this, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he leaned back again. But this time, the silence around him was different. It was not a test anymore. It was an answer. And the meeting, the deal, the power dynamic that had seemed so clear just minutes ago, now felt uncertain, reshaped by a single voice that had refused to stay quiet. And in that quiet, controlled shift, everyone at the table understood something they had not expected to learn that day. That the most important person in the room is not always the one with the title, but the one who sees what others choose not to see. No one spoke right away, not because they did not have something to say, but because they were calculating, adjusting, realizing that the ground beneath the conversation had shifted without warning, and Victor let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, just long enough for the truth to settle into every corner of the table. Then he turned his attention back to the documents in front of him, flipping one page slowly, deliberately, as if confirming what he already knew. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice calm, directed at Emily, not as a request, but as an expectation. And that was the moment the room truly changed, because a waitress was not supposed to be asked to explain a multi-million-dollar structure. She was not supposed to be part of the strategy. She was supposed to disappear after serving water. But Emily did not look surprised. She did not look flattered. She simply set the tray down on the nearest empty chair and stepped closer to the table. Her movements controlled, almost clinical, as if she had done this before in a different life. "The initial offer looks generous," she began, her tone even, her words precise. "But the clause on page 4 adjusts the ownership after projected growth milestones that are intentionally delayed, which means you lose leverage while they gain control." One of the investors leaned forward, frowning slightly, flipping to the page she mentioned, while another adjusted his glasses, reading more carefully now, and the translator tried to interrupt again, his voice sharper, more urgent. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, but Victor raised a single hand, not looking at him, not acknowledging him beyond that small gesture, and it was enough. The man stopped speaking, because power did not need volume to be understood. Emily continued, her focus never breaking. "They are also undervaluing the expansion costs by about 12%, which makes the return projections look safer than they actually are." The words landed clean, without hesitation, without embellishment, and Victor watched her closely, not just listening to what she said, but how she said it, the confidence, the restraint, the absence of performance. and something in his expression shifted again, not surprised this time, something closer to recognition. "You are not just listening," he said quietly, still in Russian. "You are analyzing." And Emily met his gaze, just for a moment, before answering. "Someone has to," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just a simple statement that carried more weight than any argument at the table. One of the American investors leaned back, exhaling slowly. "If what she is saying is accurate," he said, glancing toward Victor, "then we need to revisit everything." And Victor did not respond right away. He let the words hang, then closed the folder in front of him with a soft, final sound that echoed more than it should have. "We will," he said, his voice steady, decisive, and then he looked at Emily again, fully this time, as if the rest of the room had faded into the background. "Stay," he added, a single word. But it was not a command, it was an acknowledgement, and for a brief second, Emily hesitated, not because she was unsure of herself, but because she understood what staying meant. It meant stepping out of the safety of being unseen. It meant being part of something that could not be undone. And then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, because the decision had already been made the moment she chose to speak. And around them, the meeting resumed, but it was no longer the same meeting. The numbers were questioned, the assumptions challenged, the tone different, sharper, more careful. And through it all, Victor watched, not the investors, not the documents, but the woman who had walked in unnoticed and, without raising her voice, had rewritten the entire conversation. The conversation did not return to normal. It recalibrated. Voices became more careful, words more deliberate, as if everyone at the table had suddenly realized that precision mattered more than confidence. And Victor let them speak, let them question the numbers, let them circle around the implications Emily had laid out so quietly, because he was no longer interested in what they claimed to know. He was interested in what they had missed, and after several minutes, he raised his hand again, not to silence them this time, but to redirect them. "Page 6, he said, his tone measured. "Explain the contingency structure." One of the investors began to respond, flipping through the document, but hesitated, just slightly, his certainty not as solid as it had been before, and Victor did not wait. He turned his attention to Emily once more. "You," he said simply, and there was no confusion about who he meant. Emily stepped closer again, her eyes scanning the page for less than a second, before she spoke. "It is designed to look like protection," she said, her voice calm. "But it shifts liability back to you if the market underperforms, even if the projections were inaccurate from the start." Another silence followed, heavier this time, because now the pattern was undeniable. This was not one mistake, not one oversight. This was a structure, intentional, layered, and carefully hidden beneath language that most people would never question. The translator looked down, avoiding Victor's gaze, while the investors exchanged looks that no longer carried confidence, only concern, and Victor leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable, but his mind already several steps ahead. "So they control the upside," he said, almost to himself, "and redirect the downside." Emily gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, and there was no need to add anything else, because the simplicity of it was the most unsettling part. One of the investors finally spoke, his voice lower now. "We need to pause this deal," he said, glancing toward Victor for confirmation, but Victor did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder completely and placed it on the table with deliberate finality. "No," he said, quietly, and the word caught everyone off guard, because it was not what they expected, not after everything that had just been revealed. But then he continued, his gaze shifting toward the men across from him. "We do not pause," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "We renegotiate." And the difference was clear. Pausing was hesitation, renegotiation was control, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of power had visibly shifted, not because of volume, not because of authority, but because of clarity. And Victor turned back to Emily, studying her again, not as a curiosity now, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "You said someone has to listen," he said, still in Russian. "Who taught you that?" And this time, Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if deciding how much of the truth to reveal. And when she looked up again, Her voice was just as steady. "Someone who was not listened to," she said, and the answer lingered, not fully explained, but enough to suggest a history that did not belong in a place like this. Victor held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging not just her words, but the weight behind them and around them. The meeting shifted into its next phase. Numbers were revised, terms reconsidered, strategies adjusted. But the most important change was not written on any page. It was understood that the person who had changed the direction of everything was not sitting at the head of the table, but standing quietly beside it, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. And as the discussion continued, Victor did not look away from the details. But he also did not stop noticing her, because in a room built on power and perception, she had revealed something far more valuable: the difference between hearing and understanding. The meeting did not slow down. It sharpened. Every sentence now weighed before it was spoken, every number questioned before it was accepted, and Victor guided it without raising his voice, without repeating himself, because control did not need to be loud when it was absolute. "Adjust the equity structure," he said calmly, his eyes on the opposing side of the table. "Remove the delayed milestone clause and rebalance the liability distribution." One of the representatives across from him hesitated, clearly unprepared for the sudden shift that would significantly change the risk profile. He replied carefully, choosing his words with caution, but Victor did not look at him. He glanced instead toward Emily, just briefly, as if confirming something unspoken, and then back again. "Yes," he said, "that is the point." The room fell quiet again, not out of confusion this time, but out of realization, because the negotiation had turned completely and irreversibly, and the advantage they thought they held had dissolved in a matter of minutes. The translator remained silent now, his presence reduced to nothing more than a chair at the table, while the investors who had arrived confident were now recalculating, their earlier certainty replaced with careful restraint. And through it all, Emily stood just slightly behind Victor's shoulder, not speaking unless addressed, not inserting herself into the conversation, but fully present, fully aware, her eyes moving between documents, expressions, subtle shifts in tone, because she understood that what was happening here was not just about language. It was about intention, about reading what was not said as clearly as what was. After several more exchanges, Victor closed the discussion with a quiet finality. "We will expect revised terms by tomorrow morning," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Until then, there is nothing more to discuss." The meeting ended not with applause or agreement, but with a collective understanding that something significant had changed. Chairs moved, papers gathered, polite handshakes exchanged with a restraint that had not been there before, and as the room began to clear, Victor remained seated for a moment longer, his attention no longer on the deal, but on the person who had altered it. Emily reached for her tray, returning to the role she had stepped out of only minutes ago, as if nothing had happened, as if she could simply fade back into the background. But before she could turn away, Victor spoke, his voice quieter now, but no less precise. "Stay," he said again, and this time, it was not about the meeting. The last of the investors exited, the door closing softly behind them, leaving the room still, almost silent, and Emily paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, considering the moment. Before turning back to face him, Victor studied her for a second, then another, as if assembling pieces of a puzzle that did not quite fit. "You do not belong here," he said, not as an insult, not as a dismissal, but as a statement of fact, and Emily did not react the way most people would. She did not defend herself. She did not look offended. She simply held his gaze and replied, "I know." And there was no bitterness in it, only clarity. Victor leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful now, less guarded, more curious. "Then why are you here?" he asked. And for the first time since she spoke, Emily allowed a small pause before answering, just enough to suggest that the truth was not simple. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "it is the only place left." The words settled between them, not dramatic, not heavy, but real, and Victor did not respond immediately, because he understood something in that answer, something that did not need explanation. And in that quiet moment, with the deal resolved and the room empty, The dynamic shifted once more, not between power and position, but between two people who had both learned, in very different ways, what it meant to be underestimated. The room had emptied, but the silence remained, not the tense kind from before, not the kind filled with uncertainty, but something quieter, more deliberate. As if the space itself was still processing what had just happened, Victor stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with a small, practiced motion, his eyes never leaving Emily, who now held her tray again, as if returning to that role could somehow undo the last 20 minutes. But it could not. Not anymore. You understood every layer of that deal, he said, his voice calm, measured. Not just the language. Emily did not answer immediately. She shifted the tray slightly in her hands, grounding herself in something familiar, something simple, before meeting his gaze again. Language is the easy part, she said quietly, and Victor's expression changed, just slightly. Not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition. As if that answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect, he took a step closer, not imposing, not aggressive, but intentional. Then what is the hard part? He asked. And Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes flickering for a brief moment toward the now empty doorway, as if measuring distance, time, consequences, before returning to him, knowing when to speak, she said. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else she had said so far. Victor studied her in silence, the kind of silence that was not empty but active, observing, evaluating, connecting details that others would overlook. You waited, he said, more to himself than to her. You let it unfold. Emily gave a small nod. Because if you interrupt too early, she replied, they dismiss you. And if you wait too long, it is already done. Victor's gaze sharpened slightly, not in challenge, but in focus. And today, he asked, why did you choose now? And for the first time, there was a pause that lingered just a second longer than before, not hesitation, but memory. Because this one mattered, she said, her voice steady, but quieter now, and Victor noticed that shift. The difference between confidence and something deeper, something more personal. He did not press immediately. Instead, he moved to the side of the table, picking up the folder, flipping it open again, not to review the numbers, but to confirm the pattern she had pointed out. And as he did, he spoke again. You have done this before. It was not a question, and Emily did not deny it. She simply said, not like this. Victor closed the folder once more slowly this time, and looked at her fully, no longer as someone out of place, but as someone who had chosen to be exactly where she was. Who were you before this? He asked, and the question hung in the air, not demanding, not urgent, but unavoidable. Emily's grip on the tray tightened just slightly, enough to register, but not enough to reveal. More than she intended. Someone who thought being right was enough, she said, and Victor did not respond right away, because he understood what was hidden inside that sentence. The implication that it had not been enough, that something had changed, something had forced her into a place where being right was no longer rewarded, only ignored. And in that moment, the distance between them shifted again, not in status, not in power, but in understanding. Victor placed the folder down and stepped back slightly, giving her space without dismissing her presence. You changed the outcome of a deal worth more than most people see in a lifetime, he said quietly. Without a title, without a seat at the table. Emily did not react. She did not smile. She did not show pride. She simply replied, I corrected it. And that was the difference. Victor let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, as if adjusting his own perspective. Most people would have stayed quiet, he said, and Emily met his eyes again, calm, unwavering. Most people do, she answered, and the truth of that settled into the room. Not heavy, not dramatic, just real. And Victor nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate, acknowledging not just what she had done, but what it meant. And as the silence returned, it was no longer filled with tension or calculation, but with something else entirely. The quiet understanding that the most important shift had not happened in the numbers on the page, but in the moment. Someone chose not to remain invisible. For a moment, neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had already been understood without words, and Victor turned. Slightly, walking toward the window that overlooked the city, the late afternoon light reflecting off the glass buildings in a way that made everything look distant, almost unreal. He stood there for a second, his hands in his pockets, not as a gesture of authority, but of thought. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less formal. "People like you do not stay in places like this by accident," he said, still facing the window. And Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "Sometimes they do," she replied, and Victor gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No," he said, turning back to face her. "They stay because something pushed them there." The words were not sharp, not accusing, but they carried weight, and Emily felt it, the precision of someone who had spent years reading people the way others read reports. She did not deny it, but she did not confirm it either. She simply said, "And sometimes they stay because leaving costs more." Victor studied her again, more carefully this time, not looking for surface details, but for patterns, connections, history. "You are not just trained," he said slowly. "You were part of it." And Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, just for a fraction of a second, something that acknowledged the truth without inviting further questions. Victor noticed. Of course he noticed. He always did. And that was when he made the decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same clarity he applied to everything else. "Come work for me," he said, the words direct, unembellished, as if they had already been considered long before they were spoken. Emily did not react the way most people would. There was no surprise, no immediate answer, just a quiet pause, as if she was weighing something far more complex than the offer itself. Victor continued, his tone still calm, but now carrying a different kind of intention. "You already understand how I operate," he said. "You understand how they operate," he added, nodding slightly toward the door where the investors had exited. "And more importantly, you understand when something is wrong." Emily looked at him steadily, her voice just as composed when she finally spoke. "That is exactly why I cannot," she said. And this time, Victor's expression shifted, not into frustration, but into curiosity. "Cannot," he repeated, not questioning her decision, but the reason behind it. Emily set the tray down again, slower this time, as if grounding herself before continuing. "Because once you sit at the table," she said, "you become part of the system that decides what gets ignored." The words were not confrontational, not emotional, but they were firm, rooted in something she had already experienced, and Victor did not interrupt. He listened, fully, the way he had not listened to anyone else in that room earlier. "And I already know what happens when the wrong thing is ignored," she added quietly. And there it was again, that layer beneath her words, something personal, something unresolved. Victor held her gaze, not trying to persuade, not trying to counter, but trying to understand, and, after a moment, he gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Most people would have said yes," he said, and Emily's response came without hesitation. Most people were not there when it mattered, and the simplicity of that answer left no space for negotiation, no room for pressure, because it was not about opportunity, it was about principle. Victor exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal that the conversation had shifted again, not toward control, but toward respect. "Then stay where you are," he said, not as a dismissal, but as a recognition. "But do not stay invisible." Emily met his eyes, steady, calm. "I never was," she replied, and for the first time, Victor allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, not of victory, but of understanding, because in a world where most people measured value by position, she had just proven something far more difficult to ignore, that presence does not come from where you stand, but from what you are willing to say when it matters. The moment did not end with her words. It settled, quietly, into something neither of them tried to interrupt, and for the first time since the meeting began. Victor looked away first, not out of dismissal, but because he had already taken what he needed from the conversation. He walked toward the door, then paused, just briefly, as if considering whether to say something more, but instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture so small it could have been missed, and then he left, the door closing behind him with a soft, controlled sound that did not echo, but lingered. And Emily stood there for a second longer, the tray still resting against her fingers. Before she picked it up again, returning to motion, returning to routine, as if that was where she belonged, and within minutes, the restaurant resumed its rhythm. Glasses clinked, conversations overlapped, orders were called out and delivered, and no one in the room fully understood what had just happened in that private corner. No one except her, and one man who had already left. The rest of her shift passed without interruption, without recognition. The same tables, the same polite smiles, the same quiet efficiency, and if anyone noticed the difference in her, they did not say it, because the difference was not visible. It was internal, a line that had been crossed and could not be undone. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed slightly and the crowd thinned, the manager approached her, his expression uncertain, as if he had heard something but did not know how to address it. "Emily," he said, lowering his voice. "What happened in that meeting room?" She looked at him, calm, composed. "I did my job," she replied, and he hesitated, clearly unsure whether that answer was enough. But after a moment, he nodded, because there was nothing in her tone that invited further questions, nothing that suggested she had done anything wrong, and that was the part that made it harder to challenge. "Well," he said finally, "just be careful." And she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she understood what he meant, not about rules, not about policy, but about stepping into spaces where she was not expected to exist. After her shift ended, she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city quieter now, the noise softened into something distant, and, for a moment, she stood still, looking out at the street, the passing cars, the reflections of lights in the windows, as if grounding herself again, as if reminding herself where she was, because for a brief time inside that room, she had stepped into a different world, one that she knew too well, one she had left for a reason, and yet, it had found her again, not by chance, but by choice. Her choice, she began to walk, her pace steady, her mind not racing, not overwhelmed, but clear and just. As she reached the corner, a black car pulled up beside the curb, smooth, precise, stopping exactly where she stood. The window lowered slowly, and Victor sat inside, his expression the same as before, controlled, unreadable, but not distant. "Get in," he said, his voice calm, not commanding, not persuasive, just certain, and Emily did not move right away. She looked at him for a second, then at the car, then back at him, measuring the moment the same way she had measured every other one that day. "I already said no," she replied, her tone steady, and Victor gave the slightest shake of his head. "This is not about the job," he said. "It is about the truth you think you already understand." The words landed differently, not as an offer, but as a continuation, and Emily felt it. The shift, the invitation not to join him, but to see something she had not yet seen, and after a brief pause, not long, not dramatic, she opened the door and stepped inside, not because she had changed her answer, but because she knew this conversation was not finished. The car door closed with a soft, deliberate sound, sealing off the noise of the street and replacing it with a quiet that felt intentional, controlled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the city lights passing in slow reflections across the window as the car moved forward, smooth and uninterrupted, and Emily sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture composed, as if stepping into this space had not changed anything. But Victor noticed the difference, not in her movement, but in her awareness, because she was not looking around, not taking in the luxury, not reacting to the environment. She was focused, waiting, and that was when he spoke. "You think you left that world behind," he said, his voice calm, not accusatory, not persuasive, just precise. And Emily did not turn to look at him immediately. She watched the reflection of the city lights in the glass for a second before answering. "I did," she said quietly, and Victor gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of her certainty. "No," he replied. "You stepped away from it, but you never stopped understanding it." And that distinction settled between them, subtle but undeniable. Emily turned her head slightly then, meeting his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Understanding it is exactly why I left," she said, and Victor studied her for a moment, longer than necessary, as if measuring the weight behind her words. "And yet," he said, "you stepped back into it today." Emily did not respond right away, because the truth of that did not require defense. It only required recognition. Because it mattered, she said. Finally, and Victor's expression shifted again, not in surprise, but in something closer to agreement. It always matters, he replied. The difference is who decides to act on it. The car slowed slightly as it approached an intersection, the outside world continuing its rhythm, unaware of the conversation unfolding inside, and Victor reached beside him, picking up a thin folder, placing it on the seat between them. "Open it," he said, and Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Before reaching for it, her movements steady, controlled, she opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the first page, and then the next, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not visibly to most people. But Victor saw it, the recognition, the connection, because the names, the structures, the patterns, they were familiar, not from the meeting earlier, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere she had tried to leave behind. "This deal," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, "it is connected." Victor nodded once. "To the one you were thinking about earlier," he said, and Emily looked up at him, her gaze sharper now, more focused. "You knew," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Victor leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "I suspected," he replied, "but now I am certain." The silence that followed was different, heavier, because this was no longer about one meeting, one mistake, one correction. This was about a pattern, a system, something larger than either of them individually. And Emily closed the folder slowly, her fingers resting on the cover for a moment before she spoke. "That is why I cannot be part of it," she said, and Victor did not interrupt. He did not challenge her. He simply listened, because this was no longer about convincing her to join him. It was about understanding why she refused. "You think stepping away protects you from it," he said quietly, "but it does not stop it." Emily held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "No," she replied, "but it stops me from becoming it." And that was the line, clear, defined, unmovable. Victor nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in respect, because he understood that kind of boundary, even if he did not share it. And after a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "Most people believe power comes from being heard," he said. "But today," he added, looking directly at her, "you proved something else." Emily did not ask what. She did not need to, because she already knew, and Victor finished the thought without raising his voice. "It comes from knowing when silence is no longer an option." The car came to a gentle stop, the engine still running, the city lights steady outside, and Emily reached for the handle, pausing just briefly before opening the door. "Then do not ignore it next time," she said, her tone calm.